In January 2008, the SIHA conference took place in Melbourne. Piotr and I were in the same session chaired by Thomas da Costa Kaufmann and Peter Schneemann on the idea of world art history. There, Piotr presented his toward a horizontal art history, while I discoursed on the revenge of the good savage. Entitled Crossing Cultures, Conflict, Migration, Convergence, the conference was announced in the art magazine Artlink not only as a major event for Australia, but also as the conveyor of, I quote, a new global art history. Since then, global art history was debated in media meetings. Its alleged horizontality spread in the past years, making the historiographic discourse more complex and intricate. Of course, the idea of a global discourse was not a novelty in 2008. It was more a tendency which renewed in a different manner with the aspiration of the late 19th century art history. However, talking horizontality in 2008 sounded like a daring exhortation, one that could not be pronounced from other position but marginal, and I put quotation marks here, but I don't like to do like that, so just imagine the quotation marks. If I have evoked this episode and the idea of a global art history, which is by no means my subject today, it is precisely because of marginality, both as a position and as a condition. I would like to explore the role played by Eastern Europe in extending the historiographic field, not only through spreading its horizontality, but particularly through complexifying its discourse. I will do that by yet an even more marginal position, speaking architectural history, with all its idiosyncrasies. I think you understood from this rather eclectic introduction that my point here is historiographic, combining an interest for both the history in the making and the criticality of the bigger picture. I am borrowing here the image used by Alejandro Aravena, the curator of the 2016 Venice Architectural Biennale, the same as I have borrowed, while shifting its sense, his heading, Reporting from the Front. The lady on the ladder is the German archaeologist Maria Reiche, studying a Nazca site. Standing on the ground, she could not make sense of the stones whose patterns were only readable from above. I feel a bit like this archaeologist, as my intentions are to scrutinize the different patterns drawn by the different threads of history, while attempting to decipher the great pattern of their coming together. After 1989, there is no need to explain why 1989 represented a major threshold for the art/architectural historiography, whose field and narratives potentially extended all of a sudden. Da Costa Kaufmann, apostle of Kunstgeography, insisted on how this date affected the gaze of art historians by referring to a personal experience, how the writing of his court, cloister, and the city, the art and culture of the Central Europe 1450 to 1800, that started in Berlin in 1989 to 1990, was marked by the geopolitical mutation that occurred then. The mutation was announced by an architectural/urban event, the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, architectural historiography appeared to be not only slower to react, but also differently impacted than art historiography. While a multitude of shows on the recent Eastern European art opened in many places of the Western world, architecture remained almost silent. One could reply that this difference in reaction resulted certainly from the perception of the great majority of the architectural production of the former communist bloc as the very embodiment of its decried ideology, hence unrelated to any form of dissent, such as that expressed in the art shows. And, as a matter of fact, the little interest raised by the architecture behind the Iron Curtain came from the so-called paper architecture, assimilated to a form of unspoken protest. That was the case of the examples published in the 1987 special issue of AD on the uses of tradition in Russian and Soviet architecture. Under the cover of the postmodernist turn to history, few drawings and models forced the architectural limits imposed by the political control. This lack of interest from outside was doubled by a lack of interest from inside. For ideological reasons, architectural historians paid little, if ever, attention to the socialist years, which they considered as an ill-fated parenthesis, deploying all their efforts on other periods whose study had been hampered by the previous political regime. Hence, the first consistent analysis on Eastern European architecture concerned avant-garde and the modernist movement. Not only there was almost an obsession with this forbidden period, see for instance the substantial number of Romanian publications on the topic, but this eagerness was largely stimulated by the Western editorial policies. In 2001, at a conference on Eastern Europe organized at the MIT, and actually I think that Stephen was there, Eva was there, and perhaps Kasia, I can't remember that, the then architectural editor of the MIT Press clearly stated his modernist interests around a dinner conversation. New objects, new methods, new narratives. Such a framing corresponded, I'm speaking about the modernist interests. So such a framing corresponded meanwhile to the dominant discourse for which the marginal territories of architecture deserve to be included, if ever, for their struggle to integrate the Western move. It was in this context of alleged expectations from the Western architectural historiography and of tactical responses from the scholars working on Eastern Europe that a new object emerged in the late 1990s. This was developed around the identitarian issues forming at the time the core of a rather new field, that is nationalist studies. The thematic choice came somehow as a reaction which was twofold. Embracing it represented a manner of addressing a topic perceived as particular for those territories, while critically probing the modernist discourse. Certainly, the identity issues were not reserved to peripheries and to colonial/geopolitical dependency situations, as we learn with the advancement of the scholarship in this field. Most often, it was a disguised way from the centers of reinforcing this dependency. Nevertheless, the historiography built up around identity, and the list is too important to be quoted here, was the first to have questioned the dominant discourse and to have largely contributed not only to its geographical expansion, but mainly to the renewal of its methodology. Chronologically speaking, it was this narrative that brought a new historiographic positioning, breaking the canon while integrating Eastern Europe in a very Larry Wolff-like approach in the new rising voices from the peripheries. But if this topic crossed sometimes the implacable border of changing the political regime, its main chronology remained confined to the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. The studies on the socialist years came very late, starting mainly as a fierce criticism against the collapsed regime. This late start had two major reasons: the reticence of the local scholars to deal with the problematic topic, discarded as an emanation of the former ideology, and the difficulty to document the period, given the often poor state of the archives and the politicized bias of the existing bibliography. However, it was this field that brought the most innovative approaches. After a rather slow progress in the 2000s, the studies on the former communist bloc eventually exploded in the past decade. Object-wise, it propelled politics. So there is not really a connection in between the covers you are going to see and what I'm going to say, but it was a manner to pay a homage to these books. So object-wise, it propelled politics on the front of the stage, but also economic and the technological issues like planned economy and prefabrication. One of its most important contributions was undoubtedly the interest for the ordinariness. Not only did mass housing come out of the closet of its deplored anonymity, but its analysis brought along new ways of dealing with architecture. Because all these new objects quoted here above implied and engendered new methods. Among these, the capacity to build a narrative with poor documentation by using the references coming from other fields, mainly politics, but not only, by including trivial sources, by resorting to oral sources, witnesses of the former regime. Yet another method, used already by the identity studies, focused on circulation and transfers, thus exploring both the porosity of the Iron Curtain and the political tactics of the communist regime, while projecting Eastern European architecture on the Cold War screen. Sometimes borrowed from other disciplines like sociology, anthropology, etc., some other times simply made up for the purpose, these new approaches contributed explicitly or just implicitly to a shift in writing on architecture today. Strategies, situating the discourse. To go back to the lady archaeologist on her ladder, the historiographic threads of Eastern European architecture assembled into three major patterns which, seen from above, could be read as the canon, the particular, and the political. Each of these patterns require tactics and strategies in order to make them visible, and in spite of their difference of object and of speeds of development, they often used similar means. These latter follow three main directions, and I don't imply by the graphical correspondences that each term corresponds to the other one, integrating, contextualizing, connecting, which actually corresponded to the strategy used first by the architects of the region, assimilating the major canons of the time, promoting a local image, exchanging with the centers and the outside world. The first two strategies are typical for marginal territories in general, but led paradoxically to an augmented peripherality resulting from the very effort to situate the phenomenon. How many of us experienced, especially in the past, the annoying necessity of allotting an important part of the paper for situating his/her topic in front of an unprepared audience or readership? While dealing with connection and flows, circulation, transfers, exchanges, purveys an inclusive approach which puts barriers of any kind in perspective, attempting to bring as much as possible centers and peripheries closer to each other. This methodology of flows greatly embraced lately, especially in creating complex triangulations within the Cold War chronology between the first, the second, and the third worlds, is by no means new. This reminds one Józef Szygowski geohistorical approach that integrated peripheries to the mainstream discourse thanks to transfers, circulations and correspondences, a method that this Austrian citizen of Polish origin, trained in Vienna, Berlin, and Munich, elaborated in response to the centric vision of the Vienna school. Until now, with the exception of Szygowski, I did not quote any name. Allow me now to mention few of the most instrumental scholars who succeeded to render visibility to the architecture of the former communist bloc: Mart Kalm, Juliana Maxim, Henrietta Moravchikova, Kimberly Zarkor, working each from different perspectives on housing, mapping socialist districts, decoding the concept of microrayon, analyzing the value of prefabrication. David Crowley, Andres Kurg, exploring the material culture of the former bloc, Liliana Blagojevich, Vladimir Kulic, Maroe Mrduliash, dealing with the non-aligned movement and the unfinished modernities. Akos Moravansky pointing to the connections between the second and the third worlds, and Lukáš Stanek developing his approach into triangulation mentioned before. Daria Bosharnikova and Steve Harris moderating a whole networking around the idea of second world urbanity. Aside these, many other names help to enrich the today historiography. But how can this latter be understood? As a strong inner voice, or like a multitude of voices melting in a choir of diversified narratives? Reporting from a hot spot of the architectural front, the EHN International Conference in Tallinn. In June 2018, EHN organized its first international conference in a former communist country. The context being perfect for that, I have proposed to discuss the relevance of situating Eastern Europe in today's historiography in a roundtable entitled "Who Still Needs Eastern Europe?" Debating with the speakers in the roundtable and with the audience on the need or the utility of addressing today Eastern Europe aim not only to reconsider the place of our topic within the historiographical grid, but first of all to question the very fundament of this grid. From this perspective, the EHN conference in Tallinn was the right spot both geographically and methodologically. Indeed, since its founding in 2005, the network has worked intensively on opening and widening the architectural historiographic narratives, significantly contributing to stimulate and host a scholarship on and around Eastern Europe. The challenge of the roundtable was that not to demonstrate this scholarship, which is henceforth well installed, but to assess its place within what is meant to be an open historiographic discourse. When the expanded geography of the architectural historiography turned into a multiplicity of geographies, Eastern Europe found itself otherwise marginalized. Now it appeared centrally situated, but remaining, however, far from occupying a central place in the discourse. In this time of mutation, the question is how to conceive today of a discourse on Eastern Europe which would be relevant not only for its own history, but also for its place within the large discourse. The answer is twofold, reflecting the strategies adopted by the scholars working on Eastern Europe, an area studies positioning versus a dilution, imbrication of the narrative in the larger historiographic picture. This second approach is on the rise. A quick statistics based on the past 10 years international conferences proves it, embodying quite a historiographic tendency. Its stance is an implicit criticism against the area studies standpoint. Instead of reinforcing the discourse, the concentration of its topics and the consanguinity of the debates contributes to its marginalization. To use an image from outside the field of art architectural history, let me remind you how the Balfour Declaration in 1917 in favor of establishing of a national home for the Jewish people was perceived as an act of anti-Semitism. To go back to Eastern Europe and the predicaments of its architectural historiographic positioning, the standpoint favoring a situated argument reproaches to the dilution tactics its incapacity to address, in the context of an enlarged frame, a substantial ideological analysis. The fact that the two approaches were defended and debated within the roundtable among the speakers and attendants, being some of the scholars quoted before, did not come as a surprise. What was surprising, though, was the point of view backed by an outside speaker, Francisco Martinez, a young anthropologist born in Spain in 1982, educated in Tallinn, living and working between Estonia and Finland. For this representative of the Erasmus generation, Eastern Europe is a confusing concept. I quote, a spatial temporal container, a condition, a zombie category, end of the quote. And what matters the most are the aspirations brought by this territory into the European picture after 1989. To conclude, rewriting architectural history. Allow me to go back to my departure point, the SIHA conference in 2008 in Melbourne. The essay in ArtLink noted that, I quote, there was very significant public interest in the conference and that more people had attended the open session at the Melbourne Town Hall on Monday, January 14, than had come to hear Al Gore on climate change, end of the quote. I don't know if finally integrating Eastern Europe into the new discourse had the same shaking effect. Also, I'm not sure if Eastern Europe has yet the place it deserves within the architectural historiography. What I'm sure of is that it had largely contributed to a shift in the new ways of addressing the discipline. Whether situated or displaced, its narratives influenced and inspired new approaches. And what I'm also sure is that there is still a lot of work in terms of writing, but also in terms of understanding, as metaphorically seems to indicate the font used for announcing this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Carmen. Thank you.